Well, the Republican Party recently got some bad news regarding their desperate bad faith schemes to prevent democracy from flourishing in the purple battleground state of Wisconsin. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, folks, so this one's very important. I'm excited to talk about it. It's the latest development in an ongoing story that we've discussed on this channel. And you may not realize it, but it actually has national implications, even though it concerns directly a single state. So back in March or April, I actually went to Wisconsin along with the communities associated with Vosh and Destiny. And if my grandmother's watching, again, those are very prominent political streamers, to door knock and canvass on behalf of a woman running for the state Supreme Court, Janet Protasiewicz. Now, like most states, Wisconsin actually elects their Supreme Court justices. So they have 7 justices on the Supreme Court. One of the conservative justices was retiring, okay, which meant that if we elected a liberal justice, it would actually swing the balance of the court back to the left. Now, this would be a big deal in Wisconsin no matter what. It's always good when the left has the advantage. But the reason that I went up there, even though I don't live in Wisconsin, and it was bitterly cold in March and April, is because Wisconsin is a purple battleground state. So it's one of those swing states which can go either way depending on the election. So for example, in 2016, it went for Donald Trump. In 2020, it went for President Biden. And actually, it was the site of many schemes by Donald Trump to steal the election from Joe Biden. They actually tried to make it go its way through the Supreme Court. And there was a lot of shenaniganry involved with Wisconsin Republicans in trying to help him. Okay, so it's a big deal. And when I say Wisconsin's a purple state, I mean it. So according to Pew Research, for every 1 conservative citizen, you will find 1 liberal citizen. It is a 50-50 state. And yet, because of bad faith Republicans managing for a brief moment to control the trifecta, so the governorship, the state legislature, and the Supreme Court, they were able to radically redraw the voting maps in Wisconsin, and they are the worst gerrymandered voting maps in the country, according to conservative and liberal experts, by far. So the Republican Party has effectively gerrymandered their way into a super majority. It's incredibly bad faith. It's incredibly dangerous. So Janet Protasiewicz actually winning the election was huge because it meant that if there was a Supreme Court challenge to the voting maps, it would very likely be heard, and it stood a good chance of being struck down. Well, that's the situation we're in. Recently, the Wisconsin Supreme Court has announced that they're going to hear another challenge to the gerrymandered voting maps in Wisconsin, which again could not only affect Wisconsin's, internal politics, actually allow democracy to flourish there, but it could have an impact on the democracy for the rest of us because, as we know, Republicans operate in bad faith, and if bad faith Republicans control the Wisconsin, voting maps or whatever, it could entirely swing the results of the election in 2024 for Donald Trump or somebody like him. But what's funny is Wisconsin Republicans have been urging, publicly calling on Janet Protasiewicz to recuse herself from any case concerning the gerrymandered maps because she said during the campaign that she thought the maps were rigged. Now, when she didn't indicate that she was going to recuse herself, and we recently got a definitive answer on that, they've actually threatened to impeach her. They threatened to remove her. Okay, but more on that in a minute. Well, she has officially rejected calls to recuse herself. She says she's not going to do it. We're going to get into some of her opinion. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court, in a 4-3 vote along partisan lines on Friday, agreed to hear a challenge to the Republican-drawn state legislative maps after newly elected liberal justice declined to recuse herself. Janet Protasiewicz's decision to remain on the case increases the chance that Republicans who control the legislature and drew the maps may proceed with the unprecedented step of impeaching her. Robin Vos has threatened impeachment if she doesn't step down. Okay? So I want to get to some of the right-wing comments on the Supreme Court about this decision before we go on. So Chief Justice Annette Ziegler, a conservative, said in her dissent that liberals were hearing the case only because they now have the majority. She said it appears to be evidence of a partisan and political rather than reasoned and restrained approach and thus departs from the constitutional role of the judiciary. She has no real basis to establish this, right? The fact of the matter is that conservatives and the conservative court in Wisconsin, they act politically. They hear cases which are convenient to them, but what she doesn't like, what Ziegler doesn't like, is the fact that she is now in the minority, and the liberal justices are now flexing the same muscle that the conservative majority, or the former conservative majority, used to which I say, tough, deal with it. Conservatives don't like it when liberals start playing by their rules because, as I say, conservatives can either lose a fair fight or they can lose an unfair fight. But either way, we're going to start playing by your rules, and I love this. Republicans argue Protasiewicz prejudged the case, which could result in a new, more Democrat-friendly maps being drawn before the 2024 election. Conservative Justice Rebecca Bradley, in her own scorching dissent, likening the majority's decision to a mad Tea Party, went after Protasiewicz for not recusing. The probability of actual bias on Protasiewicz's part likely approaches 100%. Now, I will say, Bradley was the one that we've discussed in previous videos who mentioned that the Second Amendment is such that a person has a constitutional right, according to Bradley, to not only own a firearm, but to get drunk and to brandish the firearm and to threaten to kill roommates. Right? That's how far the Second Amendment goes. You have a constitutional right, according to Bradley, to get drunk, pull out your gun, and threaten to kill other people living in your house. She's deranged. Now, I want to draw you to a specific statement in Protasiewicz's 62-page or 64-page opinion. She says, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but I love how she actually quotes the late conservative justice of the United States Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, who basically made the case, because of course he did, that a judge or a justice giving a vague opinion which indicated a bias regarding the topic of a case isn't actually a sufficient basis for recusal, even though that might seem counterintuitive. But it's not true that a judge who states his position on issues during a campaign will feel compelled to rule in accordance with him. Justice Scalia explained, "We doubt, for example, that a mere statement of position enunciated during the pendency of an election will be regarded by a judge as more binding or as more likely to subject him to popular disfavor if reconsidered than a carefully considered holding that a judge set forth in an earlier opinion denying some individual's claim to justice." So the point is, what she's doing, she is actually throwing the words of very powerful conservative judges and justices right back in these conservatives' faces. And I love it, okay? Now, I will say, other justices, both liberal and conservative, have spoken out in the past on issues that have come before the court. This is the Wisconsin Supreme Court, though not always during their run for office like Protasiewicz did. Current justices have also accepted campaign cash from political parties and others with an interest in court cases, but none of them have faced threats of impeachment. Okay, I will also point out that the Wisconsin's legislature and the Supreme Court have actually weakened recusal requirements. So they have actually set themselves up for this. They went out of their way to give conservative judges and conservative justices a blank check to litigate their biases and not require them to recuse. And now they don't like it that a liberal justice is actually availing herself of the same weak recusal rules that they set up. They're basically like, no. We were supposed to be able to exploit that for our benefit, not you. And I love that she's just flatly rejecting it. Folks, this is great. I love this energy. This is phenomenal. Now, when I say that the Republicans in Wisconsin hit some bad news, it wasn't just that the Wisconsin Supreme Court agreed to hear a case challenging the voting maps in Wisconsin, and it wasn't just that Justice Protasiewicz said, no, I'm not recusing myself, deal with it. It's also that one of the major retired judges that the Republican leader in Wisconsin hired to try to find a basis to impeach Justice Protasiewicz said there actually isn't one. Former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice advises Republican leader against impeachment. There should be no effort to impeach a liberal Supreme Court justice based on what is now known. A former justice advised the Republican legislative leader who asked him to review the case. Some Republicans have raised the prospects of impeaching Janet Protasiewicz, as we discussed. On Friday, she declined to recuse herself. And David Prosser, one of three former justices to review the possibility of impeachment, said that you shouldn't, advising Republicans against moving forward with an impeachment. Prosser turned the email over to the liberal watchdog group American Oversight as part of an open records request. To sum up my views, there should be no effort to impeach Justice Protasiewicz on anything we know now. Impeachment is so serious, severe, and rare that it should not be considered unless the subject has committed a crime or the subject has committed an indisputable corrupt conduct while in office. Folks, that's not looking good for Robin Vos. Now, of course, he's not obligated to defer to, what David Prosser says, but it just says something that you clearly respect this man enough to seek his counsel, and he's telling you guys, just give it up. Impeachment is actually for, something infinitely more serious than a judge potentially being biased, and being biased in a way which you've tolerated when it's been justices and judges that you like, so it's just not really good basis for it. In response, Robin Vos, the legislative leader of Wisconsin, released the following statement. Justice Protasiewicz should have recused herself. We think the United States Supreme Court precedent compels her recusal, and the U.S. Supreme Court will have the last word here. Justice Protasiewicz is asking to be taken at her word that she will apply the law. Given the Wisconsin Supreme Court is limiting its review of the redistricting case to two questions, legal contiguity and separation of powers, applying the law should be straightforward. The Wisconsin Supreme Court addressed these very questions less than 2 years ago, and the law remains the same. But as we know, both from state Supreme Courts and the United States Supreme Court, precedent can be overturned. We saw what happened with Roe v. Wade. We see it all the time. The problem is that these terrible, bad faith, lying conservatives don't want a liberal to exercise the same discretion, flex the same muscle, and exploit the same loopholes that they do with impunity all the time. Justice Protasiewicz may very well be doing that, and I'm here for it. I'm okay with it. It's okay to play by the same standards, especially if they're legal, which they are, that conservatives use to try to thwart democracy, to defend democracy. I'm A-okay with it. Janet Protasiewicz should not hold herself to a higher ethical or legal standard. There's no extra law. She shouldn't create law and hold herself to it. If the recusal requirements and the standards were legal for conservative justices to do what they do, then it's okay. She's actually obligated, I would argue, to hold herself to the same standard and do exactly the same things that they would do, except for her own opinion. I'll also point out that a judicial commission in Wisconsin dismissed complaints against Protasiewicz, regarding the fact that she called the Wisconsin voting maps rigged. The complaints alleged that her comments calling Wisconsin voting maps rigged had violated the state's judicial code of ethics. The panel's dismissal is a blow to Republican efforts to impeach her or force her to recuse herself, and this was weeks before she actually made the decision to not recuse herself. So the Wisconsin Judiciary Disciplinary Panel has dismissed several complaints, I love it, folks. I'm here for it. This is what I'm talking about. We need to see this from every liberal, every progressive in high office in every state at every level. We need to see it at the federal level. We need to say that, listen, Republicans, conservatives, if you're watching, if you're listening, we have begged and pleaded along the way for you all to comport yourselves in good faith. You haven't done it. You have no interest in doing it. The system that you've helped create doesn't incentivize you to do it in the first place. Fine. We can't make you do it. But you know what we can do? We can start playing by those same rules. And perhaps you'll face a liberal or progressive political movement that is no longer fighting with a blindfold on and one hand tied behind its back in terms of politics. You may encounter a liberal, progressive, socio-political movement that takes off the blindfold and says, okay, let's fight this politically. I'm using this as a metaphor, politically, on even footing. Your two hands versus my two hands, my two eyes versus your two eyes, etc. and so forth. Liberal and progressive officials should be pushing ruthlessly for a fair fight, no matter how much Republicans and conservatives desperately try to run away from it. I love this energy. I love the fact that Robin Vos and others are freaking out about it. And if they go ahead with the impeachment, which they shouldn't, but if they do, Janet Protasiewicz in the Supreme Court and Governor Evers, the Democratic governor of Wisconsin, should fight it every step of the way. And there's been discussions that if Wisconsin does impeach her, they may not convict her so as to leave her in limbo, right? Because if she's impeached and convicted, then Governor Evers, the Democratic governor, can simply appoint someone to fill her vacancy. So we can just basically reset the clock, and he could be like, okay, I'm just going to pick another progressive judge. This time she won't have said, or he or she won't have said that the maps are rigged. I'll just pick a progressive judge that I know will probably decide the case in my favor, and we'll just reset the clock. So there is the idea that Republicans would impeach Justice Protasiewicz but not convict her and just leave her in limbo, in which case she can't preside over cases. In which case, Justice Protasiewicz should just resign, and Governor Evers should appoint somebody else. They should just completely destroy these voting maps, make Wisconsin, the purple battleground state that it is, eligible for democracy again, and hash it out again. It's entirely possible that Republicans can still win this, that Republicans can act in bad faith and find some way to undermine her. But I think their options for doing so to any meaningful extent have seriously constricted, and I love the fear, the obvious fear just radiating from their pores. They're so desperate to avoid a fair fight. But it looks like they're about to get one, whether they like it or not.